Bioshock is one of those rare examples where most of the public would agree it's one of the greatest first-person shooters to have ever been released. And that's saying a lot considering it came out in 2007 alongside other first-person shooters such as Modern Warfare or Halo 3. In fact, when you look back on the year 2007 in general, it was packed with iconic releases: Mario Galaxy, Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, Portal, so for it to stand out above competition like that is no easy task. But looking at it from today's perspective, Bioshock still holds up incredibly well and manages to deliver one of the greatest stories in gaming. So why is that? At the time of the release of this video, if I actually managed to do this correctly, it has been exactly 15 years since Bioshock became available to the public in August 2007. And in those 15 years, it would seem the opinion people have of this game hasn't been diminished but rather elevated even further. When discussing some of the greatest games of all time, Bioshock often finds itself on the list in some way or another, with more new players experiencing it for the first time even now. It doesn't seem to have many hurdles that hold people back from playing this iconic experience, unlike many other classics, so once again, why exactly is that? In this video, I'll be taking a deep dive into Bioshock, figuring out how a game that's 15 years old still manages to hold up as a breathtaking experience without showing too much of its age. This video will contain spoilers for the story of Bioshock, so continue at your own risk, but if you're planning to play this game, then I highly recommend coming back after you're done. But with that said, let's have a look at how Bioshock manages to remain a masterpiece 15 years later. We'll start off by taking a look at the story of Bioshock, which I will split into two halves throughout this video because despite all the praise I will provide this game as the video goes on, the main plot itself can actually seem a bit bland or simple on the surface. We'll keep going back to a lot of what Bioshock's true story is, but for now, it's good to get a general idea. The game is set in 1960, where you play as Jack. You find yourself in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean after a sudden plane crash within the first 20 seconds of the game. Lucky for you though, you end up right next to the lighthouse, which, if that wasn't sus already, it is in fact an entrance point to where you spend the entirety of the game. An underwater city with different rules and views on how a city and its people should function. This of course being Rapture. As you're going down deeper and deeper underwater, you hear an audio message from Andrew Ryan describing the ideology behind Rapture, why he chose to create this society away from everything else and with what vision in mind. Imagine a salesman telling you how prestige of an item they have available and why it's the perfect choice for you, why you should leave all other things behind and focus on this one item instead. But of course it doesn't take long for you to realise that things aren't exactly what you would imagine, as the first thing you witness is someone getting brutally murdered in front of you, followed by a radio communication from a man named Atlas who claims he wants to help you after surviving the plane crash and you quote unquote have to trust him. But hey, you literally just survived the plane crash and somehow got extremely lucky, or unlucky, to have found this place, so you might as well listen to the guy for now, right? As you listen to Atlas, he provides you with information regarding Andrew Ryan, splicers, big daddies, little sisters, plasmas, and even himself a little bit. Now I do find it pretty funny how our boy Jack literally needs instructions to pick up a crowbar for defense, but when it comes to injecting himself with an unknown drug, he literally does it without a second thought. He doesn't even get told to do it. I'm not sure if this was meant to be character development suggesting Jack's day-to-day activities, but that's how I looked at it. Regardless, all of this happens within the opening 15 minutes or so, acting as a great hook to give you a few things you want to find out more about already. And this idea of finding out more is exactly what Bioshock will have you doing into the very final moments of the game. As you continue surviving and making your way through the first sections of Rapture with Atlas's help, you learn about his hate towards Andrew Ryan as well as his wife and child who he wants nothing more but to be reunited with. It is from this point onwards that the basic setup for Bioshock's story is complete. Your name is Jack and you ended up in Rapture after a sudden plane crash. A city like none other where any man or woman can dream freely and not be restricted in bringing to life any ideology they may have. No chains thrown on anyone who would be considered to think outside the box. A true land for the free. Or at least that's what you expected to see below the Atlantic Ocean. Only to be met by bloodshed, greed and twisted minds at every corner. Luckily, a man named Atlas is helping you make it through the corrupted and unrecognizable city, all whilst requesting you to help him in his reunion with his wife and child. So whilst that might not sound boring or simple, it may not be enough to be considered one of the greatest stories in gaming. Which brings us to the other half of Bioshock. Because whilst the story of Jack is good enough on its own to make an impact, it is heavily excelled by its other half, the story of Rapture. The underwater city that sunk from the mightiest heights to the bloodstained lows. I honestly like to think that I have played a fair amount of games in my life. From first-person experiences to turn-based RPGs, I have witnessed and fallen in love with many worlds in many different games. But Rapture is a bit different. It's not just a great setting, it's not just an iconic location. Rapture feels alive, or rather on its last breath, but you the player are constantly learning and re-experiencing its past memories through audio logs that are spread throughout the city, as well as remains of different monuments to allow for better imagination of the glory this city once had. It's as if Rapture itself is telling you a biography of the lives that once occupied its walls. Whilst Jack is the protagonist of this story as he travels to different locations of the city in order to help Atlas, you learn of different individuals, friendships, affairs, betrayals, artistic desires, and much more. Throughout the city, you will constantly find audio logs which contain short recordings from previous inhabitants. Each one of these has a photo of the person attached alongside the name, helping you form an image of this person's life as you find more of their recordings. This is one of Bioshock's biggest strengths when it comes to elevating a story. It relies on the player exploration itself to learn as much or as little as they want. Rather than forcing countless amounts of information on the player, it's all optional for whoever wants to search for it. However, this doesn't cause any issues due to what I previously referred to as the two halves. You can play the entire game without going out of your way searching for audio logs, only picking up the most obvious and necessary ones along the way, and you will still be able to grasp a story that makes sense and doesn't require hours of research after the credits roll. However, for those who decide to learn about Rapture and its people, a whole new level of storytelling will be presented to them. It is the biggest reward any player can give themselves. If Rapture was a jigsaw puzzle, then each audio log would be an individual piece. As you gather more and more of them, then the bigger picture is becoming more clear. Only for when you've collected every single one do you realize in fact everything in some way is connected, forming an extremely clear image. Each character's story has a beginning and an end, and whilst you may not find every audio log in order, or you just simply miss some because no one can expect you to find every single one, you can still start pulling pieces together in your head after each listen. Characters such as Diane, who was Andrew Ryan's lover only to come to realization of the feelings not being mutual, later becomes a higher up in the Atlas Rebellion. Dr. Suchong, who was a lead researcher in studying Adam, only to have his life taken by none other than his own creation in The Big Daddy. Jasmine Jolene, a dancer working for Sandra Cohen who Andrew Ryan saw potential in, only to go from being his mistress to being murdered by his hands. There are so many more characters. Dr. Steinman, Fontaine, Julie Langford and many more. All of these have a story and connections to others that come together to form this finished puzzle that is Rapture. Whilst I definitely have a lot more to say regarding the story and world of Rapture, I feel it's important not to overlook or ignore what the player will be doing for most of the story. That of course being the gameplay itself. Because whilst on paper it is just a first-person shooter, the reality of it is Bioshock far exceeded its time in terms of what the gameplay would offer to the player, allowing it to feel so natural even now for first-timers. The game has a good understanding of evolving gameplay. When looking back every few hours of game time, you can see and feel the difference in how confidently you are approaching levels and sections of the city, and that's without an actual leveling up system for the character himself. All of this mostly comes in shapes of new weapons, plasmids and tonics that you find and unlock as you play. The opening hours of the game can have a very strong horror feel to it. Outside of incredible lighting and sound design that's presented, a lot of that also comes down to the heavily limited arsenal you have to defend yourself. It does an exceptional job of having you realize just how much of a disadvantage you are in whilst entering unknown locations. When all you have is a wrench and a pistol, you are far less likely to go around running every corner, especially when enemies can come at you from all directions. It is made very clear that resource management is key, feeling similar to games such as your Resident Evils, where you ask yourself, can I afford to waste these bullets on each enemy or should I save them for more critical scenarios? This sort of gameplay design also partially allows you to take in your surroundings just a little bit more than if you had an automatic weapon and you could buy ammo from the beginning. Because you're being so careful, you're not just running around aimlessly. You take your time, checking every corner, looking for a few more bullets, and in the meantime, discovering some of the side stories I previously mentioned. I noticed how during the final 2 to 3 hours of the story, I would run through areas much faster than I did at the start, and that's mostly due to how much empowerment I had gained over the previous 8 or so hours. These opening hours really limit your combat, but in return they emphasize how rewarding the exploration of the city can be. It is then the player's choice to decide if that's how they want to play for the remainder of the story, or if they're going to switch out their playstyle. But if weapons and ammo control were the only things available, then this 12 or so hour experience could easily become bland and tiresome. Sure, rocket launchers, crossbows, shotguns, or even chemical throwers sound fun and switch up the gameplay, but a bit more variety to gameplay approach is necessary to really elevate this to the next level. And of course, that is something Bioshock has far more than one would initially expect. Alongside a variety of weapons, one of them being a camera, which lets you research enemies for extra damage and more combat advantages, you're also provided with a wide selection of plasmids, which are supernatural powers that are always executed through Jack's left hand. These are in my opinion the second out of 3 gameplay variants in Bioshock, with the first one being gunplay and the third we will discuss in just a moment. A core theme that plays a major role in the story of Bioshock is the introduction of Adam, and how this chemical substance outgrew its predicted potential, eventually leading to the downfall of Rapture. But the initial concept was to push humans above those outside of Rapture and provide them with life-changing powers. These powers of course being the plasmids. The ability to create fire with the snap of your fingers, electrifying any foe in your sight, human or machine. Pick up and throw objects that would normally be out of reach, or even summon a swarm of beasts to attack your enemies. These are just a handful of the 12 different plasmids available to the player, and for the majority of the game you will find some use in all of them depending on your surroundings and situation. That said, I won't pretend even for a second I actually found myself using all of these. Electro Bolt was far and above the best plasmid in the entire game, which is shocking considering it's the very first one you can ever use. But then you realise it stuns all enemies from splicers to machines to even big daddies, on top of the fact it has a wider area of effect if you use it in a puddle, so yeah, it's pretty overpowered, especially when you consider this is a leaking underwater city. Regardless, there is fun to be had with most of these. Some are found throughout the city, whilst others can be purchased by using Adam in its pure untouched form. But how do you acquire this Adam, you ask? Well, that choice is yours, through one of Bioshock's most interesting, and in some ways, questionable methods. Early on in the game, it is stated that these little girls you see wandering around Rapture are referred to as little sisters, and their objective is fairly simple. They care about nothing else but stabbing bodies, about finding angels from whom they can drain Adam by injecting a needle that is quite literally half their size. But yeah, absolutely nothing sus going on. As far as the choice you have to make, it is one of 2 options. Will you be the good person and rescue them, essentially returning them back to how they were before, looking like actual young girls, or will you harvest them to gain twice the amount of Adam? However, this method kinda kills them. In other words, will you be the good Uncle Jack who's okay with just 80 Adam, or will you brutally murder children because of greed? I think it's safe to say the choice is clear.
Thank you.
Regardless of your choice, if you want Adam, you need the Little Sisters. But to even get close to the Little Sisters, you'll be faced with Bioshock's most iconic enemy to date, the Big Daddies. When you first encounter the Big Daddy, it is with a clear intention of showcasing the power difference between the two of you. From start to finish, these will be the toughest enemies you will face in Bioshock. Nothing else even comes close when you consider you could use up your entire arsenal on just one of these. So before thinking to yourself, I could really do with some Adam, the question you should be asking is, am I really in a position to take one of these on right now with my current arsenal? Do I have enough ammo or health packs to outlast this Big Daddy? And if so, will this do more damage than good, leaving me with barely anything left to take on whatever else might be waiting? Well, that's where the final third major gameplay variant of Bioshock could really come in handy, that being the hacking system. With each section of Rapture, you will find countless turrets, security cameras, safes, locked rooms, vending machines, and so on, with each one of them being an opportunity to improve your quality of life. Want to save money when buying ammo or health packs? Go hack a vending machine to get discounted prices on everything you buy. What if you haven't got money or there isn't any vending machines nearby? Well, you should probably go hack that safe or that secret door over there, see if you can scavenge any beneficial items. But how about taking full advantage of the hacking system and taking control of Rapture's security system? Automated turrets, security cameras that summon more reinforcements, grenade launchers, all of these can be under your control to help you, or in some cases just fully take out whatever enemies may come your way. Why struggle for each section when you can potentially hack your way through and make Rapture yours? Make Rapture fight for you rather than you fighting Rapture. These 3 gameplay variants allow for a variety of playstyles, some preferring to be fully on the offensive guns blazing, whilst others may take the more stealthy approach with the help of plasmids. When we buy a modern game, we have these expectations for it to fulfill in terms of gameplay. There should be a variety of things to do outside of just combat to keep us entertained, but also encourage us to hunt down items necessary for upgrading or crafting. Bioshock manages to provide the player with all of this despite its age. It has a unique hacking mechanic, a crafting and upgrading system, a decent selection of weapons and plasmids for different approaches. 2 playthroughs of Bioshock could very much feel like 2 different games if the player chooses so. Of course, that is if they actually decide to play a second time. However, what if I was to tell you, Bioshock may be a far better experience the second time round? Whilst there are many games which heavily advise a second playthrough to learn more of the story with new cutscenes or playing with another character, that's not what Bioshock is about. The game doesn't change in the slightest as far as story, the only real but crucial difference is the knowledge the player has going into it. By now, it is no secret that Bioshock has one of the greatest plot reveals in gaming history. The sudden realization of being nothing more than a tool, or as Andrew Ryan puts it, a slave to Fontaine, is quite literally shattering. Everything you've done would seem to have been as Fontaine planned. He got you wrapped up around his finger, just flicking you in the right direction. Doing all of his slave work for him just as he had planned all those years ago when he decided to create you for his master plan. Considering this is revealed at about 80% into the game, if not more, really throws you for a loop. The story doesn't stop there, so you can't exactly start thinking back to everything that happened because new details and new plot points are still being revealed. And that exact moment is where second playthrough comes in. You begin the game and within the first 20 seconds you read, "Would you kindly not open until." Everything was right there, right in front of you, teasing you, almost to say, I bet this is crazy to believe, but everything you're about to do is not your choice. Such a simple trigger, something anyone could just have a habit of saying, and yet it is clear as day constantly being said to you throughout a radio message. You start questioning just how much of my actions were triggered by this code. Was there anything vital that I actually did myself, or was I the slave for every step of the way? A second playthrough allows for a deep appreciation of the amount of foreshadowing and detail that is placed across Rapture. You have all of this endgame knowledge, so now everything you look at or everything you listen to could potentially be a hidden message that's only clear to you now. All of the strings that are being pulled behind the scenes are making sense. The connections between Frank Fontaine, Atlas, Tannenbaum, Dr. Suchong. You start analysing each one of the audio recordings with more detail, wondering if there really was any clues that would have allowed you to figure out this truth earlier on. Can one of the biggest reveals in gaming history be figured out before it was intended to be told? Outside of gameplay, this is the sort of motivation that will drive you forward in a second playthrough. Finishing the game initially means you know the answers. Now, just put together all the pieces that will get you there. Having an incredible story that stands out above some of the most loved games to date, alongside a gameplay system that is so full of variety it ticks the boxes for things we expect from modern games, Bioshock makes itself easily playable even now 15 years after release. But I wouldn't claim it to stand as a masterpiece if that was all it had to offer. Because despite all the gushing I've been doing so far, I would say the greatest feature allowing Bioshock to remain so great is how engrossing and captivating it feels, mostly due to its setting. The time and location chosen for Rapture are a crucial reason for never really feeling outdated. It is a game set in 1960, a year in time and history we have all the knowledge about but not one we're accustomed to living in. At least for most of us, considering it has been 62 years, but if you did live in 1960s and just comment below or something, I don't know. So how does this benefit the game so much? Well, how about we start with the audio logs? The methods used for recording these messages can actually make sense. People would record little audio logs which they could use down the line to remind themselves of past memories. A great example is the very first audio diary you find, which belongs to Diane as she records her drunk thoughts during New Year's Eve. This audio message is not aimed at you the player, but instead these are an insight to individual thoughts, the same way we would use a diary or video recordings nowadays. Now, I'm not oblivious and can admit some of these audio recordings can be questionable and have you wondering who and why would someone actually record themselves saying this, so that's a very fair counter argument. Regardless, each one of these audio logs has an incredible voice actor behind it, really selling the character, whilst the audio quality itself isn't perfect with the occasional breakup or distortion in between sentences. It's a very small detail, don't get me wrong, but one that creates a stronger immersive atmosphere of the timeline you're meant to be experiencing. And of course, what would real immersion be without a fitting soundtrack? And you know what soundtrack is fitting for a game set in 1960s? Well, how about real licensed tracks from the mid 20th century? You know, the music that was actually listened to back then, not just something trying to replicate it. These are the sort of extra details that simply do not receive enough praise, but without them, if you weren't told the year in the opening seconds, then Rapture would just be an underwater city with some older, outdated weapons, which is still cool, but you would assume it's outdated technology rather than realizing just how advanced everything here actually is. As for the art style used, it still manages to hold up decently well. Whilst these are definitely outdated graphics for AAA standards nowadays, the game does manage to hide its weak points very well. Some being the obvious stuff like a rendered image in the distance across the city, but as for a major one that is more noticeable, it would be human characters. Whilst maintaining human bodies, most of the enemies you face are in some way, shape or form messed with. Multiple cuts in the face or masks can often explain the quote-unquote questionable facial designs. However, as for the rest of the cast in the story, there are only a few occasions when you make actual physical contact with another NPC during the game, and each time you do, they just don't look all that great. So whether this was intentional or not, knowing that the NPC models look a bit trash, Bioshock heavily relies on the audio logs to do the talking and push the story forward. And yet despite this, it doesn't allow the game to feel empty, due to constant announcements being made, new audio logs, enemies around every corner, and of course Atlas providing key information. It can even be argued this benefits the immersion further, as considering the state this city is in, most people would be hiding or at least staying behind shut doors without any access. Meanwhile, you don't have to be distracted by questionable NPC graphics and design choices. It is just you, Rapture, Big Daddies, and Adam-driven psychopaths. That is, of course, until one last final moment. The final boss. A game should never be defined by its final scene or moment. For me, I would argue the most crucial things in the game are and always will be its story as well as the soundtrack. Mostly because of how well those two can go together in selling the world you are within. But it is far too often that people will throw away all opinions they had of a game leading up to a certain point because they felt unsatisfied or in some cases disappointed with how things concluded. But if there has ever been a game where all of its fanbase, including the game's director himself, can agree the final climax, the final 5 minutes of the game that should have never happened the way they did, then that game is called Bioshock. The setup is great. There is a clear villain that stands in the way of freedom and reaching the surface, and if this was a novel, then this final chapter would most likely have been incredible as well. However, a game is still a game, so a final climax has to happen, even if it goes against everything that made the build-up so great. As I just explained, Bioshock works incredibly well without NPC interactions. Even the biggest reveal in the game is done for a cutscene without the player actually doing anything when meeting Andrew Ryan. A real strength of Bioshock is the realism behind human characters, mad politicians and scientists. But the final moment just hasn't got any of that. You take on a naked, Adam-driven Fontaine who did not look like that at any point earlier on. Not only does it feel extremely out of place, but it just kills how realistic everything else you have gone up against has been up until this point. Whether it's the Big Daddies or the Splicers, even though they may seem ridiculous at first, you spend hours in the game learning about how they came to be what you see in front of you. There is even a section dedicated to you becoming a Big Daddy, a step-by-step explanation of how Big Daddies are created, what sort of equipment is used, and even why the little sisters are attracted to being by their side. But this final boss just seems so generic and bland, arguably just forced because you need some big final enemy for a big finale, when in fact the main feeling I have during this is, come on Bioshock, you're better than this. That's ignoring the fact the fight itself is basically a big sponge you keep shooting at and need to stab it 4 times to defeat it, only to then get bodied and have little children full of bloodthirst stab every last part of his body and act like nothing ever happened, because why the fuck not? Supposedly you've rescued these little girls, setting them free, but instead here they are committing murder without a doubt. I love Bioshock and I won't let this final fight ruin the image I have, but I would be lying if I said I didn't have a sour taste in my mouth when the credits roll. Bioshock is a marvellous feat. Even when others have tried, there has not and never will be another Bioshock. It stands above many other gems of the past decades, proving there are many ways to remain a masterpiece. To simply say it has great world building and story would do no justice to just how well everything is executed and thought out to be enjoyed as much, if not even more, on a second playthrough. Every little detail is a piece that adds to the overall image. Yes, you can get a very good idea of this final image with some pieces missing, but nothing beats that sensation of being able to take a step back and see it fully complete with every little detail being connected. It doesn't rely on one single gameplay component to make it stand out, whilst also having so much of what we expect to see in modern games now. From its range of gameplay options to resource management and working your way around most efficiently, it all comes together to allow the best option depending on the player. The story of Bioshock will always be iconic with its reveals and realizations, but having gameplay which still feels modern allows it to be enjoyed for everything it has to offer, rather than just forcing yourself through for the sake of the story. This is of course accompanied by the incredible audio and music design choices. Using real licensed music can be overlooked by most people, but if you want to sell this idea of being in a city during 1960, then use music that comes straight from the 1950s. As for the recordings, the audio logs sound old, not always clear and with real believable speech. Human stutter, background noises, or breathing between sentences whilst deciding what to say next just feels real. Again, it is a tiny detail and you could just say I'm fishing, but I believe it is crucial if you intend on selling Rapture as a real city that is alive, or rather, one that was. There are many games that can be replayed no matter how old they are. Of course, people love their classic games, but very few of these games can be replayed all this time later and still fit the criteria many consumers look for in modern gaming. Thanks for checking out the video, I really appreciate it, and as per usual I sound way more relaxed now that the video is nearly over because I'm not reading from a script. I am really interested to hear what you guys think in the comments, partially because of how much I love Bioshock, but also because this isn't the sort of game I would normally talk about on the channel, so it'll be fun seeing just how little views this video gets. Regardless, if you are still here, then I really appreciate that support. I have at least 2 more videos that I want to get done this year if time allows me to do so. They will most likely be on the longer side of things. The first of the 2 is a Kingdom Hearts title, which considering I've covered Kingdom Hearts 1, Chain of Memories and Kingdom Hearts 2, then that should give you pretty much the answer you want. Anyways, a like is always appreciated, and if you care enough, I do stream every week on Wednesdays and Fridays, plus some occasional random streams for Final Fantasy XIV. So if that is something you're into, or if you just want to hang out, then drop a follow on there if you're interested. That is everything from me. I'm gonna eat something, I don't know, maybe have a drink. Have a great day or night. Hope you liked the video, and I'll catch you next time.